Welcome to the Thinking Podcast. I'm your host, Geoffrey Wu.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Brandt.
And we're excited to have our first Skype guest today. He's Professor Con Stough, a professor of cognitive neuroscience and psychology with Swinburne Institute of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. He's also the director for the Center of Human Psychopharmacology. Broadly, his research interests include understanding human intelligence and cognition from both a psychological and biological perspective. And I'll let him dive deeper into that. But I want to just make a personal sort of introduction and a connection and to tie in, how we, all came together here. A couple years ago when Michael and I first started looking into the space of biohacking and nootropics, some of the most interesting research was on one of the nootropic herbs, Bacopa, one of the main components of one of our products. And this researcher from Australia, Con Stough, was, authoring, and doing some of the most compelling research in the space. And some of our science team, Sumit and Rob, reached out and started engaging, just from a, understanding who all the interesting researchers were in the space of. And we were able to finally meet in person in Chicago earlier this year at the American Psychological Science Convention in Chicago, and now we're happy to have you join us on our podcast. I mean, it's funny to sort of connect in the intellectual space before sort of connecting in person.
Yeah, so thanks. I'm honored to be your first Skype caller, and it's great that you guys have such an interest in this area, and are really interested in the science behind it. So, obviously, I love talking about research and about how these things work and what we need to do, and it's great to find you guys who have the same sort of interests.
Absolutely.
Con, I can tell you what got us interested in the space was the idea of wanting to be smarter. If we think about the hardest working people in white collar jobs, your students, your designers, your doctors, you think about people in these jobs as being equivalent to Olympic athletes in terms of wanting to optimize their output. That's what really embarked us on this path. I'm curious to hear from you. What embarked you down the path of wanting to study and understand neuroscience and optimization there?
Yeah, so look, I've always been interested in a couple of areas of psychology called, one area is called individual differences. And this is the idea that people show differences in traits like ability and cognition and intelligence. Also things like personality as well. But even as a child, I always wondered why people were different, why some people were smarter than others, and why some people learnt different things. So as I went through university, I became very interested in understanding that the sort of brain behavior, brain cognition, brain intelligence nexus, if you like, and started wondering about if we could understand the biological basis of something like intelligence, whether we could actually improve it. And it's a really important point for all the reasons that you've just mentioned, that human intelligence is such an important trait in our society. It depends on your intelligence dictates the sort of job that you get, how well you go through university, the sort of doors that open for you, the opportunities. And just imagine if we could improve society's intelligence by half a standard deviation, or 7 or 8 or 10 IQ points. What sort of society are we living in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a concept we like a lot, right? Like, can you basically, if you meta improve the tools and the productivity of 6 billion, 7 billion people by 1%, I mean, across all that people, that's so much leverage in terms of improving, output essentially.
Not just output, but just the quality of life, the sorts of discoveries, the inventions, the cures for diseases we could come up with. I just think it would be just an amazing place. So, and the other side of that, not just improving intelligence, but helping people who are having trouble with their cognitive capacity. Whether it's as we get older, we see cognitive decline just with age, whether it's kids with learning disabilities and other issues, whether it's intellectual disability, or whether it's really difficult diseases like dementia. These are all diseases that have very strong impacts on our intelligence and our cognitive capacity. So if we can find out what the biological basis is for cognition and intelligence, then maybe we can do something about it. And that's really what our centre has been trying to do for a few years now.
That's really great. It's a very noble cause.
Before we dive into more, of Arj's questions, we actually had a couple questions from our audience. They, we gave them a sneak peek that we'd be talking to, an expert in intelligence. So Patrick, at Just a Web Guy on Twitter, asks, an obvious idea would be to talk about things that enhance intelligence, but even more interesting thing is what we should not do. So, for example, what are things that we do day to day that have a negative effect on our intelligence in the long run? And happy to hear your thoughts. We also have some of our own, ideas there as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, so I guess where do we start? There's so many things to do. Yeah. And it depends what you mean by intelligence as well. So there are obviously different types of intelligence. We're sort of narrowly focusing on the construct of cognitive intelligence, and today, obviously. But if you even narrow down on cognitive intelligence, it's a huge area as well. We can separate cognitive intelligence into verbal intelligence and non-verbal intelligence, into learning, into what we've learned, our ability to learn, spatial processing, memory. So there's quite a few different things. There's also things we do that acutely make us not as smart. If we don't sleep very well, I think sleep is an incredible predictor of cognitive performance. You go and try to do your job after just a few hours of sleep. It's very difficult. Nutrition is incredibly important as well. Perhaps not so acutely, but chronically can have long-term effects. Exercise is a big one as well.
I think recreational drugs, like alcohol, I think is an obvious one. If you're
absolutely illicit drugs, can be very impairing. Anesthetic has shown to really impair people's intelligence long term. So there's lots of things that can really affect.
That's interesting. So having too much anesthesia, that it's not just an acute effect, that it sort of adds up over time.
Yeah.
Was that that's interesting.
In certain sports, any injury to the brain can really have long-term effects as well. So.
Yeah, I think that covers, the broad things. I mean, I think it's almost like the inverse, right? Like those are things that people would say, hey, focus on sleep, focus on nutrition, focus on some good exercise, avoid, compounds that are hard for your system.
Well, look, if you think of the brain as being the most important organ, and you have to sort of feed it, and it has to be able to work at peak capacity. I mean, in terms of cardiovascular function, it's the most greedy organ in terms of its size for oxygen, and so if you impair oxygen delivery to the brain, it's not going to perform very well. So cardiovascular health is really important. Exercise is really important. But there's not one thing. There's all sorts of things, and then there's the other side of things is about nurturing your brain from a psychological perspective as well. So.
I mean, just to jump in here, so the second question is actually pretty much related to what you're just about to dive into. So just shouting out Sergio at Sergio Quiros SV. He basically asks, a lot of people possess high intelligence but can't take full advantage of it. Beyond nootropics, what are other biohacks that can help solve issues of low energy, bad eating habits, tiredness, grumpiness? So sort of like the opposite of Patrick's question, and you're mentioning... exercise.
Sure. So there's obviously another part of intelligence which has gained a lot of traction over the last probably 2 decades, called emotional intelligence, and it follows from a lot of research in what we call effective neurosciences, which is really identifying the sort of pathways and issues around emotion in the brain and how we understand and manage emotions. And so it's pretty obvious that humans are not computers. We're sort of irrational beings, really, and Our ability to think clearly and to act purposefully really does also depend on the emotions that we experience and how we manage our own emotions. So we're finding in schools that, children that have very high IQs, but are not able to manage their anxiety and even manage other negative emotions such as anger and frustration, tend really not to do as well in their exams. I guess what you would call SATs, uh, as they should in terms of their IQ. So, and we also see the other side that kids with somewhat average to slightly above average IQs do better at school than we might predict based on their IQs, because they have really good study habits, they manage their emotions, they experience positive emotions, they make great relationships with others and learn from others. So our emotions are very important, and people with anxiety disorders and depression, will really not be able to take advantage of their cognitive intelligence in terms of performance.
It sounds like the biohack is like, let's not discount EQ, right? Like I think when a lot of people think about just hard intelligence, it's like, just raw output of numbers, just, solving equations, but like the soft side of what makes us human, controlling our emotions, sort of directly correlated to our performance in IQ style tests. Yeah. So I think that's a helpful, approach and thought as all of us are going out and improving ourselves.
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, look, if you think about work in an organization, for instance, then, IQs are really important. We go to university, perhaps. We compete with other students. We get into an organization, but moving up the organization is really about how we engage others, how potentially how we show leadership, and all these other non-cognitive variables, if you like, are really important in terms of our happiness and success as well. So our IQ, our cognitive intelligence, incredibly important, but as you say, let's not discount some other aspects of our functioning.
What are some things that people can do or avoid doing to improve that sense of emotional intelligence? Which, by the way, one paper that you wrote that was particularly fascinating, I wanted to just underline for anyone listening, is that emotional intelligence correlates with life satisfaction. One of your biggest papers that connects the dots there. So it's not just a notion that having good emotional intelligence leads to a better life, but it's actually been studied with rigor by Con, our guest here. So I'm curious to hear from you, what are things to do or things not to do to improve that sense of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, so there's, I guess there's a lot that we don't understand in this area, but there's a lot of research papers now by people right around the world that showing that individual differences in emotional intelligence predict a wide range of important workplace outcomes, scholastic outcomes, well-being, life satisfaction, even some clinical disorders as well. So they are important, but unfortunately, because it's such a popular area, there are a lot of people out there who sell tests and sell development programs and things like that, which are probably not very evaluated. But in psychology, we've had a really long history of great research around clinical disorders and around emotions and those sorts of things. So really being able to experience positive emotions rather than negative emotions is really about the quality of your thoughts and cognitive structures. So, we can choose to think about in different ways about different situations. And the actual thoughts that we have really dictate the emotions that we experience. So having better thoughts about different issues will help us transition from those more negative emotions to more positive emotions. But there's a wide range of different strategies you can use to improve your emotional intelligence. If you think of emotional intelligence being comprised of different components, like understanding the emotions of others. So there are things you can do that might be able to help you understand other people better, engage other people. You can improve your listening skills and eye contact. Other dimensions are your ability to persuade others and to express emotions effectively. your ability to manage your own emotions, and to make decisions based on emotional information. So all those things are sort of theoretically different, and therefore there are different strategies for those different dimensions, if you like.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, obviously something that's sort of becoming more popular, something, meditation, or I think just in general, just like self-awareness, self-reflection, setting periods of time to like journal or to, write down things you're grateful for. I mean, I guess these are all sort of tactics to hit what you're talking about, which is how to sort of rewire thinking to focus on sort of the positive spin as opposed to focus on the negative spin. And I guess it's like all very personal to figure out, exact regimens. And I guess it's also very hard to study clinically the optimum protocol. But I guess like the general thrust is focusing on thinking, in structuring your thoughts in positive ways.
Yeah, that's right. So most
ways.
of our work these days is working with schools. So we're trying to work with younger kids because we think that's a sort of sensitive period for them to develop greater emotional intelligence. So we use all those sort of strategies in our structured programs with schools around self-awareness and engaging with others and listening to others and restructuring thoughts. And some schools have introduced mindfulness, which really does help. I know probably our generation, we didn't really do too much of it, but it really does help, and children really love it as well. So
I think there's a broader awareness. I think broader acceptance for these concepts. I think that, I think in one era it could have sounded more, new age, but I think the data is showing that, hey, there's some real compelling things here. So I think there's a lot more acceptance within our community, within our listeners that are experimenting with all of these, tactics.
That's right, and it's not hard. It's not difficult. I mean, now with you can download an app on your iPhone, and you can practice it for a few minutes a day, and start the day that way, and be much more in tune with yourself, and not feel as stressed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the quantitative results there are what's really interesting. The fact that it's demonstrated to show an effect, I think, is what's really interesting, and that's one of the defining aspects of biohacking as we know it, is the ability to test a hypothesis against a null hypothesis, to say that this thing is having an effect versus it just seems to feel like it's a good thing to do.
Right.
And so it's really on the shoulders of people doing this important research that we're able to institute things like mindfulness at the national or state level. That you can't do that unless you are able to make strong statements about the effect.
Yeah, statistical significance, getting the right, RCTs going. Yeah, I'm curious. I think when a lot of people, think about nootropics, what, after, studying, compounds like Bacopa, what are some of the, highlighting to our audience, some of the interesting results from a quantitative approach with, Bacopa? I know that, a lot of your research has shown that it increases, working memory capacity, and both, sort of over chronically. Just can you, sort of highlight and walk through some of the most compelling results that you've seen across Bacopa, but other compounds?
Yeah, so where I work is the Center for Human Psychopharmacology, as you introduced before. So it's about a group of about 40 of us. You met a few of them in Chicago, the conference, but there's probably about a dozen clinical trials on different substances going on here all the time. And they're nearly all focused on improving cognitive function across different ages and the lifespan. But the vast majority of them are actually plant-based extracts or nutritional products. Not all of them. I mean, we just started a low-dose THC study here, and we've done a few listed drug trials and that sort of thing we talked about before. But we've looked at red wine and chocolate, tea, e.g. CG, things like ginseng, curcumin. Bacopa, as you mentioned before, has been a big focus of research in our centre. And Bacopa is and what they call, it comes from Ayurvedic medicine, so it comes from India, and it's probably the oldest known herbal medicine. Actually dates back more than 4,000 years, and more recently, probably in the last 50 to 70 years, a huge amount of research, mainly in vitro and in animals, has been conducted by the Indian government. And they funded literally hundreds of studies looking at, well, what does this extract do? What are the mechanisms? And how can we make the best extract? So I guess one of the big differences between plant-based extracts and pharmaceuticals is that a pharmaceutical is always going to be the same. So if you make it the same pharmaceutical, the structure is going to be the same. It's going to have the same potency. But with a plant, there are hundreds of components in a plant. So if you want to extract something from a plant, you have to know what are the active ingredients and what's the mix of things you want to put in the tablet. How am I going to grow it? Quality control, all those sorts of things. So plant-based medicines are much trickier.
It's kind of like wine, right? Like a certain varietal of wine from Napa, a Chardonnay versus a Cabernet. There's different qualities. So in a sense, right? Like how do you standardize like Bacopa, right? I think that's why like the Bacca ratings and all of that we highlight in our products.
Well, that's right. You might want to buy a Chardonnay, but you go to a wine store and there's 100 different Chardonnays, and you can buy a bottle for $2 or you can buy a bottle for $500. So what is the difference between? I mean, it's still Chardonnay, but they're grown differently, they're looked after differently, they taste different even as well. The same thing with plant-based extracts. If you buy a plant-based extract for $2, it's probably not going to be as efficacious. It might not even have the same compounds in it than the same as a Bacopa that costs $20 for $30. It's grown differently, it's extracted differently.
And I think one of the other important factors is that there can be a buildup of unintended things like lead or other heavy metals. If that's always a risk that you might not just be getting actives, you might be getting some unintended things in there as well. We obviously test for thoroughly.
So that all costs money to the company in terms of quality control and doing regular assays in terms of what's in it, and ensuring that things that you don't want to be found in it are no longer in it. And so that's the thing. I think that's a common problem for consumers, is they don't know what a quality product is in this area. So anyway, I probably digress a little bit, but the work on Bacopa, I think it's a very established area. There's literally hundreds of papers, scientific papers. And probably over the last 10 years, there's been a bit of a push to do human trials. And there's probably been, I'd say 14 or 15, maybe more, really good randomized controlled trials with specific extracts of Bacopa. And probably about 13 out of 15 of those studies have shown efficacy and high degree of safety as well. So we know that Bacopa is pretty well tolerated, pretty safe, and the data is starting to converge to show that it's quite efficacious. And now,
in what areas? I know, just for the education for our audience. Efficacious. I think in terms of like working memory capacity, some adaptogenic sort of anti-anxiety effects as well.
Yeah. So the key areas that I think been shown for Bacopa to be efficacious are improving working memory, improving long-term memory learning consolidation, improving processing speed, and probably reducing anxiety or stress to improve cognitive functioning at stressful times.
And generally speaking, what are the mechanisms of action there? How does that happen? And how does it, as you're taking it more and more, why are you not becoming tolerant to it, or why are you not building toxicity in your system to it? Because those are standard for other things that a person might eat.
Yeah, that's true. So look, it works completely differently than, say, a pharmaceutical. So most pharmaceuticals that are aimed at improving neurotropic functioning are basically aimed at neurotransmitter function. Okay, and we know that the brain compensates for changes in neurotransmitter activity. So the brain will up and down regulate receptors. So for instance, if you're trying to give up smoking, for instance, the brain, and you stop smoking, the brain will say, wow, we need, where's all the nicotine gone? We need more nicotinic receptors, and will upregulate nicotinic receptors. for a period of time. So Bacopa doesn't really work in the same way. It works probably in a more sort of chronic way. It's multifaceted in terms of its effects. So it will affect inflammatory pathways. It will affect oxidative stress. It will affect some neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine, which we know is important for learning and processing speed. There's some evidence that suggests that it might affect beta amyloid. Some evidence suggests that it might chelate heavy metals. There was a really interesting animal study showing that increased synaptogenesis in the brain. And we're about to try to replicate that in humans here in a new trial where we're combining Bacopa and cognitive training in older people.
Older people? Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing is that Bacopa also has, the trials have covered a broad swath of populations from like healthy young adults to older people. So I think that's especially interesting for a nootropic perspective, because it's obviously a lot easier to see effects on folks with dementia or folks with disease and prove some see some effect there than on healthy human adults.
So that's true, but if you look at the historical use in India for thousands of years, it's not just been in older people, it's been in younger people as well.
Right, it's been exactly, which is why it's exciting. Yeah,
I read that Vedic scholars would take Bacopa to memorize texts.
Yeah, so I think because it acts in so many different ways in the brain, and because there's a whole range of different molecules in Bacopa extracts, it can affect the brains differently depending on age. And so we're currently doing a trial with kids with hyperactivity and inattention. There've been a lot of trials in India on that topic with Bacopa.
How'd you get into Bacopa? I remember when we were talking in Chicago that you got keyed in on this compound through a rugby player's accident. Can you walk us through that anecdote?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story, actually. I was at a conference in Sydney giving a talk on a ginkgo trial we had just completed. And I received a phone call from a woman who asked to come and talk to me about a new substance that she's been giving her nephew. And it turns out that her nephew was quite a famous professional rugby league player in Australia. And unfortunately had a very serious head injury. And all the specialists basically said that really high likelihood that he would die. If he didn't die, then he really wouldn't be able to function after that. And this woman it turns out to be actually professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Sydney, which is a really big university in Australia. And she toured the world to find substances that could help her nephew. And she eventually found Bacopa and gave it to her nephew. And her nephew has basically made a full, total recovery. And I met her nephew, and he seems perfectly fine to me. And so she was so excited by this finding that she decided to bring it into the country and sell it, and to make it available to others. And of course, our equivalent of your FDA, and we call it the TGA here, said really this is not any evidence, and if you want to make any claims, you'll need to do trials. And so she pleaded with us to do some trials. So we did some trials, and we found that after a few months, that all the people, there was a significant improvement in memory, attention, concentration, processing speed. In our first trial, this was also replicated at another university independent to us in Australia. Then we did another trial. We found pretty well the same thing. This was then replicated by a US group and by groups right around the world. And then a few years ago, one of our very bright PhD students, who's now a postdoctoral student in working with the Framingham people in Boston, Matt Parze, wrote a systematic review, and found that there was quite consistent evidence to show that Bacopa improved cognitive function.
Yeah, and I think another result that I think you were a co-author on showed that, in comparison to, pharmaceuticals like Modafinil, the effect sizes were comparable. with Bacopa, which is like super fascinating because one, like the side effect profiles for Bacopa are a lot more mellow than modafinil, but you're seeing similar magnitudes of effect sizes, which is a fascinating result.
We could really talk for a long time. I think it would be really good. Is there any way we can resume at some stage?
Yeah, it looks like our time is up here. Yeah, I mean, I think the content here is awesome. I mean, I think this would be a good teaser, piece. And I think we'll get a lot more questions from our audience. I think, the stuff that we covered, I think a lot of the EQ stuff is also fascinating, right? We could spend like an hour just talking about the EQ results.
Let's jump on a part 2.
Yeah, let's plan on a part 2. Let's sort of cut it here. And you're busy, and then Zil will reach out and schedule a part 2.
Right, look forward to it.
Let's do it.
Cool.
Cheers. Yeah.
Cool. Take care.
See you guys. Okay,
yeah.
bye.
Take care.
Have fun. Bye.
Bye.
That was interesting.
Yeah, no, I think it was awesome to we were reading, we printed out all literally a lot of papers, but a lot of Con Stough's papers, and it's just cool to start what we have in the original reason why we reached out was to start running clinical trials with his group, right? We're running our first clinical trial with a Maastricht University group in the Netherlands. You can actually find those details at clinicaltrials.gov and track that progress there. And that's focused on more of an acute effect, where Con Stough's group is focused on sort of chronic effects, including Bacopa. We have a Bacopa stack with rhodiola and alpha GPC,
or Rise,
which is called Rise, which synergizes a lot of the effects of Bacopa. I'd love to, if in our sort of off-site conversations, one of his recommended stacks is a combination of Bacopa and rhodiola. So I'm actually curious to, continue the conversation in perhaps a part 2 about other compounds and other synergies that are promising.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how he's studying this space. Bacopa has been used for 4,000 years, and there's been new findings in the last 10 years about it. And I think that there's this focus on intellectual academic rigor around what the results have to show. But I also think above and beyond that, the incentives are lining up where people want to study enhancement and improvement, where it's not just that someone is sick, someone's needs therapy to fix something, but it's saying, hey, what's something that you can take habitually that will improve your baseline operating level, basically improve your operating system, if you will. So it's we're on the shoulders of giants. It's really cool to see that it's not just us, but it's a lot of people on the other side of the world and all around that are thinking about these exact problems.
It's not even just on the shoulders. Let's gather all the giants together in the same room, which I think something that I'm one of the most proud things that I think we're working on is flying the flag of biohacking, flying the flag of nootropics high and proud, and bring these people together, because a lot of interesting data and research out there. Let's pull it together. Let's highlight it. Let's get the message out, because I think that the net positive we can affect on and change on society is so positive, as Professor Stough mentioned in the beginning, right? Improving the productivity, the output intelligence of people by a couple percent. I mean, it's something that we've talked about a lot as well. The network of humans, if each node of human is smarter, the whole entire network is more valuable.
Yeah.
I think also something that I thought he mentioned was interesting was this whole notion of EQ as a strong correlate to life satisfaction and also just intelligence.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I'm sure our listeners will want to dive into.
What was the question from Sergio again? I think it was a really good question. What was the exact? It was the.
It's so because other biohacks.
Other biohacks you could do.
A lot of people are highly intelligent. Let me just pull up right here.
Yeah.
But they are rarely ever able to take full advantage because of difficulty focusing.
I think that's interesting, right? Because I think that
That's the kind of EQ aspect,
Well, because
right?
I think there's a couple things going on there with that notion. The question, Sergio's question, which is a good question, is people are intelligent, but they sometimes can't really wrangle it. They're distracted, or they're anxious, or they have trouble focusing. And I think that it's that this notion of intelligence. Sometimes we equate intelligence with a very narrow gap of cognition or like analytical thinking. But what's coming more and more into focus is, hey, if someone's having trouble with the people that they're working with on their team, or people are having trouble focusing on things, that this is actually also part of intelligence. This is part of the larger umbrella of intelligence, where intelligence isn't just like IQ and SAT and very, like, that stuff is really important, right? I studied super hard for that stuff. I think that type of intelligence actually is extremely powerful, but also emotional intelligence is important too. And to be able to kind of wrangle your own.
It basically helps channel the IQ side, right?
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Like screwed up, you can't actually turn on your intellectual, mammalian brain. It's just your reptilian brain's like freaking out.
I think to that point, I like Sergio's question of, what can someone do if you or someone feels like you're very intelligent in that normal sense of just high horsepower, but you're having trouble kind of putting it to use. What do you do?
Right.
My quick answer is I think that things like discipline are actually really undervalued. The rote discipline, like doing something and sitting down and doing it. I think a lot of times people that we consider to be very high IQ smart can have a hard time sitting down and focusing and getting the thing done, because that's very rote. And a lot of times people who are less quote unquote smart have no problem sitting down for a long time and getting the job done. So I think that in order to build that sense of discipline, we always talk about fasting. I think fasting is really interesting, where if you can force yourself to eat some pain and force yourself to do it and keep to it, if you can do that on a weekly basis with fasting, or there's other ways of building discipline too, but fasting is just a really good one. If you can force yourself to eat some pain and build discipline, I think that helps you to kind of wrangle and put your intelligence in the right direction.
I think that honestly, that this notion of a spark that triggers something is just like a false mythology, right? I think if you talk to some of the most creative people, it's like the quote, it took me 20 years to become an overnight success. Right? Like they're constantly churning and thinking about these concepts. Like I'm sure, Einstein was constantly just doing mental, intellectual experiments, thought experiments, seeing how, light waves were bouncing around when traveling at super, fast speeds, or when, gravity was super strong. And yeah, then you have that insight, but it comes from that discipline, that rote, hey, we're going to put in a lot of hours. Because I think that a lot of people are smart, a lot of people have discipline, and it's really like merging that two together to truly do something interesting, to truly do something phenomenal, which is, high bandwidth at over a long period of time produces interesting results.
Yeah. And I think one other quick answer to Sergio's question is just work with other smart people. I think that that's often discounted because we have this idea of like the lone genius person, but I think working with other smart people is probably one of the best things.
Yeah, I think more and more there's just like so much knowledge to absorb, and like the corpus of like what is even known is bigger and bigger than ever. It exponentially grows.
Right.
So to like not be able to like take advantage of bantering and conversing and absorbing new ideas,
yeah,
is like a disservice to like yourself, right?
Because
Like you're not exposed to the catalyst, the medium to even like spawn new ideas.
Yeah, and a lot of those aspects of emotional intelligence, like motivation or discipline, those are actually really helped by people around you, right? By talking through things, by riffing. A lot of the aspects of emotional intelligence, like you can't really just control that on your own by like willing it. It's not an SAT problem where you can just keep like scratching at it with your pencil until it's solved. It's like a lot of these other aspects are actually better solved by being around other people, because people affect each other, and there's I think especially with things like
I just know anecdotally from just running Nootrobox, right? Like all of us have ups and downs, mood swings, good days, bad days, and having like you to like have awesome energy, or all of our colleagues with awesome energy helps buoy like the ups and downs of just normal human rhythms. And I think that having a team, have a support group around you, I think just attests to like the EQ factor of like, hey, controlling of the ups and downs of the chaos of life.
Yeah, well, so I think a lot of times there's a fairly popular notion of some social scientists did a study where they found that, like, if you want to predict what someone is earning, you can look at what their 5 best friends are earning. So if I don't know how much money you make, I look at your 5 best friends, average it. That's a really good predictor of how much money you make, because if all your friends are like bankers, lawyers, doctors, you're probably no idiot. You're probably making a good salary. If your 5 best friends are making less, you're probably making less. So, but then the exact same notion is true for intelligence. If I want to know how smart you are, it's like, okay, well, the 5 people that you spend the most time with on a daily basis, how smart are they?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Anyway.
So, thanks Patrick, Sergio, for those awesome questions. Our producer Zill is going to reach out and send you a thinking cap. Let's keep the questions coming in. They're a lot of fun to answer. As you know, Con also, I think, dived in and had fun answering those questions. So we'll get him on for part 2. And so, please ask away. I think we've covered a broad swath of topics there, and let's dive deeper into it. Just to quickly wrap up here. Yeah. We're, on YouTube, we're on SoundCloud, and we're on iTunes, also on Google Play. Thanks to I don't remember who requested it, but thank you to the person who requested Google Play. We're on 4 different platforms now. Until then, we'll catch you the next episode.
thanks.
Thank you.